Hey there, today let's do some sketchbook ideas for dummies. And I'm not trying to call all of you dummies, that'd be just plain rude. I've tried to come up with some super easy and fun ideas for your sketchbook, and if a dummy like me can do them, then you should have no problems. For the first page, let's make it super simple. The first thing you'll need is some round objects to trace. Start with a circle towards the bottom left of the page, then one to the top right. Join those up with an S shape. Erase some of the lines so you are left with a very curly looking S shape. Then just trace on some half circles so that the lines meet up with the curly S. It's hard to see or even explain what I'm actually doing, but once I put the black liner over the top it all makes sense. And you really don't have to trace circle objects, you can just go freehand, but if your confidence is pretty low like mine and you want to make it as easy on yourself as possible, trace away. Now it's time to go freehand. Simply draw in some little circles of various sizes to fill in the little alcoves where two lines meet. At this stage, you want to make sure all the circles are touching each other. Also, cover up any exposed line ends. Again, there's no rule here as to how many and what size. Just keep going until you don't want to do it anymore. I probably could have kept going for a little while longer to fill up the page a bit more, but I didn't want to. Now just scatter in some circles that have broken free of the little clusters. Some are still attached to the lines, but others have broken free completely and are floating around the page. Time to add some colour. I'm going to use my Sarah Renee Clark colour cubes. Again, I like to make my life easy, and these colour cubes really do picking colours simple. I just go through and find a palette I like the look of, number 433, then I pick some colours that are close. I'm going to use my watercolours and a water brush. Like I said, I'm aiming for easy here. So no mixing up colours here, just dip and paint away. Then I just spread the colours randomly throughout the little circles. Very easy, beginner friendly, and quite relaxing. Once all the circles are coloured in, I did start to fill in the little gaps with black, but I didn't like how it was looking, so I abandoned it and called this finished. Not quite sure what I just made, but hey, it's something. Moving on to idea number 2. I've drawn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines that you can't really see. Then I space out some dots evenly over the lines as a guide. Over the top of those dots, I draw in some random little pictures, starting with a flower. Then I scatter more flowers throughout. I also draw a little moon. Not that moon because it looks really dodgy. I instead use a circle drawn within a circle and voila, a moon. I also scatter on some little hearts, teardrops, butterflies, leaves and feathers. If you do this, you can do whatever doodles you want. You could even do an ocean themed one with little seashells and starfish. Next, using the line to guide you, start drawing in little circle shapes, which are going to be beads, along the lines, partially joining up your little pictures. Then with the little gaps that are left over, just draw in a straight line. And you should have something that looks a bit like hanging beads with charms, kind of like the ones you can get to hang in doorways or hanging from a dream catcher. Before I add some colour, I lighten the line work with a kneaded eraser. For my colours, I use card number 205. It's one of my favourites. I'm going to use my Ohuhu alcohol markers to colour this in. So I use my swatch cards to find markers in the closest colours possible to the colour palette card. And I actually ended up getting colours really closely matched. Then just colour in all the little charms first, putting colour wherever you want. No rule here. This part is rather easy because the colour cube card has done the hard part in my opinion. And yes, it's looking rather average at this stage, but don't be put off, it will get better. Once the colour base is down, I go back in with some coloured pencils to create a bit more variation in the colours, with just a few shadows and lighter areas. You can spend as much or as little time as you like for this bit. For the line work, I use 2 different thicknesses of fine liners, using a finer point for the smaller beads and a slightly thicker one for the charms. This is unnecessary, but I do like having a little variation. I also use the finer of the liners for the details within the charms. Time for some white highlights. And I start out by using my Signo gel pen, but I seriously hate this thing. I do a few highlights, stop for literally a few seconds, go to continue, and the nib has already dried up, so I have to wipe the nib before being able to continue. Very frustrating, so I ended up switching to a fine tip Posca. Much better. And finally, because I forgot to do it before, I use the black fine liner to draw in the remaining string lines. And it's done! I quite like this. Easy, cute and colourful. For idea number 3, I've drawn in some guides, which you probably can't see, but they're just some rectangles I measured to fill most of the page. I'm going to attempt a simple patchwork quilt pattern. I use watercolours to put down the base using a wet on wet technique, painting over each individual rectangle, with plain water, then go over it again with a very juicy watercolour paint. I probably shouldn't have used such a juicy watercolour in this sketchbook as the paper's not really suitable, but hey, I'm just experimenting and I'm not trying to create some award-winning, show-stopping piece of art. For the base of the quilt, I chose the 3 primary colours, but later I wish I'd used a colour card to guide me. I'm already not totally digging what I'm doing here, so I go over the opposite page in some gesso to cover up the alcohol marker bleed from the previous page. And later I will do another patchwork quilt design in a different medium and using a different colour palette. But once the watercolour is fully dried, I use paint markers to draw on some little patterns, like flowers, hearts, stripes, dots, etc. It's a good time to experiment with patterns and shapes. And if you get a bit of mental block like I did, just Google pattern ideas or patchwork quilts and pick out some that look easy. Remember, try not to overthink it. It's just supposed to be fun and enjoyable. Once all your patterns are done, go around each square, I used black, and then pop in some stitches. And this one is done. I don't really like the colour palette at all, but there's something enjoyable about painting a patchwork quilt. And I will revisit this idea again later. My 4th sketchbook idea is an easy, minimal thinking one. I'm going to use a colour cube card again, number 378. And I opt to use my Ohuhu alcohol markers again. Then I just start filling my page with hearts. Nothing fancy, just create blocks of colour using hearts. I actually got this idea from a screensaver on my TV. I used one of those Google Chrome casts, and the not in use screen shows up random artworks or photographs. And there was something like this that showed up, except it was done using watercolours. But I haven't used my alcohol markers much lately, so I thought I'd just try them out. Once the page is full of hearts, I go back in with a colourless blender and add some patterns to some of the hearts. The colourless blender will remove some of the coloured ink. You just have to go over it a few times to make it show up. Then I use a white gel pen, yes, the same stupid gel pen I gave up on before, to add some more details. I'm not really digging this page though, it looks unfinished, so I use some pencils to go around the outside of all the hearts that have no pattern. Still looks unfinished, like I need to do more on here, but I'm kind of done with it. So this may not be a complete idea, but maybe it's a starting point for someone else. And maybe one day I'll come back and figure out how to make this look finished. But now it's time to move on to idea number 5. And I warn you, it's the worst of the bunch. So I'm gonna rush through as quickly as I can. I use my Derwent Inktense pencils to create a rainbow in one colour, using 3 different versions of that one colour. Then, in the same colour, I use very watered down watercolour to swipe over the Inktense pencils. Then, using the Inktense pencils again, I add in some patterns while the page is still wet. I do this 6 times, using all the colours of a basic rainbow to create 6 rainbows. I don't think it's a bad idea, I just rushed it and it really shows. If you want to give something like this a go, you don't necessarily need Inktense pencils. That's just what I have. This is actually the last idea I had. But now I'm going to revisit the patchwork quilt idea again. This time I'm using gouache paint and 2 colour cube cards. The blues I will use as the base of the fabric squares. I have a limited set of cheap gouache, which I think I've only used once before, and I didn't have a lot of success then. I think I was trying to use it like acrylic paint, and I ran into a lot of trouble. I also had a little problem here, as I ran out of white when I was trying to mix up my colours. So I used some tubed watercolour paint mixed in with the gouache. It seemed to work okay when I first put it down, but when I did my second layer of paint, after the first had completely dried, it did go a little patchy. Not sure if that was my funky white watercolour or maybe user error. The second colour card I will use to create the patterns on top. By this point, I did go out and buy some more gouache paint, including an extra tube of white. I love how these two colour palettes look together. Seriously, these colour cubes are such an asset for any creator. And I think this patchwork quilt is looking way better than the first. I tried to make these squares look prettier and more cottagey, like an old granny's blanket that she might have over her lap on a rocking chair sitting by a fire. I don't know, something like that. Instead of using a harsh black line, I use a dark blue pencil to do the outline. Then, after I've done that, I change my mind and use a dark blue paint pen to go over the top, which I regret. I think I wrecked it. But too bad, it's done and I learned something. Hopefully. I also used the coloured pencil to create the stitches. And it's done. While I don't really like that paint pen outline, I really like the gouache painted quilt pattern better than the other. Let's do a quick revisit of my sketchbook ideas for dummies. First, we have the colourful little circles. Easy, relaxing, and somewhat strange. Then we have the strings of colourful little beads and charms. I like this one, it's fun. Then we have my lazy rainbows. Next is the unfinished heart page. Nothing too exciting here, but maybe a good warm-up for when doing a bigger art piece. Then we have the watercolour quilt, followed by the gouache quilt. Well, that's it. I hope this gave you some ideas to work with if you're struggling with your sketchbook, and I hope to see you next time.